Welcome back, everybody. Up next is the governor control housing for the D3400 diesel engine. And these are pretty basic. Not a lot goes on. We're going to take this thing apart, give it a good cleaning, inspect everything, put it back together today. So quick breakdown. This arm with linkage on the back that that connects to the throttle lever that the operator opens and closes. This arm on the inside connects to the fuel rack of the injection pump. Governor spring forms the connection between those two. It has its own slotted guide rod. This is a pivoting stop. It'll come up against this bolt with lock nut. That is the high speed stop, adjustable for the diesel engine. And then this big set screw with lock nut is the low speed stop for the diesel engine. And on the end of it, there's a spring loaded plunger that forms the fuel shutoff detent. Beyond that, that's really about all there is to this piece. Pretty simple. It is not a fluid compartment. You just need to lubricate, grease these components as necessary, put the cover back on, and if anything ever starts getting stiff or sticking, just kind of clean it out, lube it up again, and away you go. So let's take it apart. So first thing, we'll get that linkage off of there, flip it over, and once you loosen the pinch bolt, this lever will come right off. So you spread them just a little bit with a screwdriver, helps them to release their grip on the shaft. There. It's been a while since that one's been off. Next thing you want to do is remove the key for that arm. Now, because this shaft is a press fit onto this pivot right here, we need to press this shaft out of the housing. All right, there's the key that locates that pivot onto this lever. You can see we're starting to get a little bit dry where it pivots in that bushing. That's why we take these things apart, so we can get all this stuff cleaned well and freed up. Now we need to get this shaft right here out of this this upper lever. And basically what you do, you can just tap this one out. It's not really a press fit in the housing or anything. And you'll just drive it out the back here. You can see this little core plug that's sealing that hole. Just use that pin kind of as a drift, unseat that plug, and the whole thing will come out that back side. There's the plug. Just looking at the pin for any kind of wear. A couple slight little witness marks, but no wear, so that's good. So now that we've got both of the main pivots out of there, both of those levers and the spring can be withdrawn. And the only thing I've really seen wrong here is the parts manual clearly illustrates well, you can see the governor spring. We are hooked to the front side of the bar here on the top. Parts manual indicates that, or illustrates that, this bottom hook should also be on the front side of this bar. They have this one on the back side. We'll correct that, straighten that out. I don't know that it's going to pose a problem, but it's sometimes the little things like that that add up in a governor that make all the difference. All that's left to do now is to pull the cotter pins and remove the main pins. And we'll just disassemble these pieces from one another. Spring comes off that guide rod. Yeah, you can see from the shiny part here, I think with having that hook to the back side, it was actually wearing on there. Yeah, you can see a corresponding witness mark there. I think having them both on the front side is going to be a much better fit rather than having to wrap that thing back around. So we'll put it back together properly, just the way the manual indicates. And final thing left to do is to take your adjustable speed stops out. You can see we've already done some work off camera. I've noted how many turns in each one of these was. We will reset them to those initial measurements when we put it back together, but chances are I might be tweaking those a little bit. I haven't been into a D2 yet that I was completely happy with the shutoff and the speed stops and everything else. So that pretty much does it for this housing. There's nothing else left in it. There's no seals, there's no anything, because it doesn't hold fluids. So we just need to clean everything up now. So it's sometime later, but everything here's clean. Gaskets are made, housing's cleaned up. That turned out well. And all the minor pieces are also cleaned. Everything's been inspected. Basically, just make sure nothing is loose, nothing is worn, like the bushing in the arm, the needle bearings inside, the shaft that the needle bearings ride on. Make sure there's no excessive play, nothing's rough, nothing's loose. Because in a governor assembly, I mean, thousandths of wear can make a difference. Even all the rest of the pins and the bolts in that link, everything just needs to be in as nice of condition as possible. So to begin the reassembly, I'll start by reinstalling the low speed stop and the high speed stop into the housing at the settings that were noted in disassembly. Like that. So next we'll do just a dry run assembly of the governor spring linkage. So we'll put the spring on there with the hooks on the front side of the bar. Take this piece, just start the pin in it. Then it goes through the bottom hook of the spring. We'll just temporarily slide this cotter pin in like that. Take this piece, start the pin in the base of that. It goes through the upper hook. We'll temporarily pin that with the cotter pin. So that's how everything is oriented in the governor spring assembly. So when I do the permanent assembly on this, all critical areas will be covered in assembly lube and all cotter pins will be folded over, just as you see this now. So next step is to position this assembly into the housing. Like that. And then we'll, I think we'll put this shaft in up here for this upper pivot first. Got a light coating of assembly grease on this pin. I don't know that any of it's going to make it through because it's kind of a light press fit through there, but we're not starting out with it dry anyway. And I've got the needle bearings inside this upper lever completely packed with grease, so nothing's going to be running dry. Want to carefully start those needle bearings onto the shaft because they can damage easily. Around to the back side now. You can put that plug back in. Next up is this lower pivot pin that goes in this hole here and presses into that lever. Now we have the keyway slot in there. You have to be mindful of the key that's in the shaft to make sure everything gets lined up. Now, since we're going to need to press that in, what I'm going to do, I got this just a cheap hardware store, flimsy, thin, half-inch washer, cut a slot out of it. I'm going to set this washer underneath this pivot, and what that's going to do is prevent this pivot from being tight up against the inside of the housing once we push that shaft down into it. So just pardon my hand, I know it's in the way, but just get that washer positioned there, set the pivot in on top of it. Now we'll start the pin, and luckily the keyway is belled out a little bit on this this leading edge, so you can feel when you get the key started in it. There we go. Now we'll just take this to the press, make sure the washer stays below that pivot, seat that thing in. All right, so now we can take our washer out of there. There we go, got that back. Flip it over, and we can put the lever on the back side. Got it right here. Pinch bolts cleaned up, just loosen the end of there. So just line it up with the keyway, slide it on. It's a lot easier than it was taking it off. Of course, everything's clean now. So to control our end play, I'll support that shaft in there, and we'll just kind of push that down to the housing. That'll keep that from popping in and out too bad. Cinch the bolt down. End play's about right. Check movement of everything here. And got spring action on the governor. Now, we'll check the plunger in here. Make sure it plunges. It's fairly stiff, so, yep, good spring tension there. Spring action, I should say, on that. So, that pretty much completes the reassembly process on this, at least until we get it put on the injection pump. Let's do that next. Just a couple things to address real quick before we put these together. I've got the new gasket made that goes between the governor and the pump. You really want to pay attention to the thickness of the old gasket that came out of here, because this is what dictates your end play on the pump camshaft. With no gasket in here, the pump camshaft thrust washer would pretty much be flat up against this area in the governor housing, and you would have no end play. So we're about 20 thousandths thick on this. That's pretty close to what the old gasket was. Beyond that, there's really no book spec for end play on that camshaft. And then we have the plug that seals the back of the fuel gallery. New cat O-ring for that. That is a 8B4967. Now, problems can arise once you get the O-ring positioned on the plug, because you have to compress that O-ring quite a ways to get it to enter that rear passage. So to assist in things, I built this, and at first glance, it's basically the world's smallest welding table, right? All kidding aside, it's a plug pusher. You can also use this as a puller on here too, if you have one that's still stuck that the brass drift doesn't want to take it out. But like I said before, the plug is threaded 3/8 by 24 fine threads in the center. So the plug can just start on the end of the tool. The tool then attaches to the back of the pump housing using these two 5/16 threaded holes that are already there. And the way this works, I use an open-ended wrench to turn on this nut on the inside, and what that does is it drifts the bolt and the plug in tight to the housing, and it maintains enough pressure that you can use a very dull tool and carefully help to start this O-ring into the groove. That kind of compresses it, and you can keep your inward tension on it, and eventually you'll work it right in. Like I said, nice dull screwdriver. I kind of keep this one around for jobs like this. Just working that O-ring in, you'll eventually get it compressed to the point where it's going to decide that the easier place to go is inside that groove. It's just getting it there is the hard part. All of a sudden you'll get it to where the O-ring just kind of pops in there, and give a quick check here. It's looking good all the way around. Yep, we're in the groove, and we didn't peel out any little pieces of it, so we're sealed. Run that plug home. Getting that O-ring started is not a lot of fun, and I don't know why Cat liked to use such tight-fitting O-rings on so many of these assemblies, but they did. All right, release tension. Now I can remove the tool. Don't worry if the plug still sticks out a little bit when you put the governor on. That'll mash that thing home. All right, we can finally put the governor onto the injection pump, but I'll catch you up on what's been going on off camera. I've recently engaged in a few rounds of argument with this pump because of this plug. Now, remember I just said that when the governor housing goes on, it will fully compress that plug and seat it all the way home. Well, my problem is The O-ring is an unusually tight fit in this one, and I double checked all my manuals. This is that first gen pump casting. They call for that O-ring that I put in there. It's the right, proper, and correct one. I've never had one so darn tight in there though, and you can see there's still some compressibility to that O-ring because I can move the plug in just with hand pressure, but I can't make it seat and go flush with the back face of this housing, and I don't want to exert so much force on the face of this governor housing that I damage that by just trying to crank those bolts down. It's not going to go flush, and I can't get the amount of compression that I need to get both housings tight up against the gasket in that area. So here's what I did. Well, you can see the old gasket that I took out of there. They had completely covered over that plug. There was no cutout, and I left quite a witness mark because, like I said, these are usually tight, but there's no way I'm going to get that to seat. So my first attempt was to basically cut out around that plug so that it gives me some relief right there, so I'm not having to take the 20 thousandths of gasket and lay over the top of that, hoping that plug's going to extend into the hole that I made, and it'll give me enough, basically enough relief, like I said, to make everything mate up properly. That still didn't work. I was still just a little bit loose back here. So what I did is I went out thicker. Here's a 40 thousandths gasket. I did the same thing. I cut out a relief for that plug, and finally I had a good fit up right there. Now granted, going with a thicker gasket is going to increase my cam in play somewhat, and 40 thou seems a little bit wide to me. Even in my book, they don't give me a spec, but I guess I'm going to pick my poison here. I did try and find an O-ring that was a more suitable size for here that wouldn't have to be compressed so far. Not really coming up with much there. I thought about machining off a little bit of the back shoulder of this plug, but then again, it's going to start making it thin. It's going to still have pressure on it, and I don't like that either. I don't need that to crack. We do not need fuel leaks from back here. We got 15 psi in this fuel gallery. This has to be sealed. I want a nice tight fit on that O-ring. And I'm not going to go and try and mill the seat in any further in this fuel gallery. Now, is this just a little bit different of a dimension seat in here for that O-ring because it is that first generation pump housing? I don't know. I've never run into this before, but I've verified my parts. Everything is correct. Basically, like I said, I'm picking my poison. We're going with a thicker gasket, and it's a good fit with this thicker gasket. I'm still exerting adequate pressure on this plug and having to draw that in with the bolts, but it's not so much that I'm putting excessive force on anything. So we're putting it together with the thicker gasket. That is the decision I have made. All right, all those bolts are tight, so now we install the link that goes from the fuel rack rod to the governor spring arm. Now this is the one where we had trouble pivoting the shaft when I first took it apart. So we'll turn that down, put the link in. The head of the bolt is going to end up facing toward the rear like that. Start the nut. These are these small castle nuts. They're going to have to be pinned. Okay, that one's done. Back one goes in now, and I know somebody's going to ask, yes, I do put grease on these. I want to have grease on every one of the pivots in here. Just keeps everything moving freer longer. Same process for this one. We'll castle nut and pin it. Okay, do a quick operational check here. So, shut off, lever down. We're going to watch this plunger back here, and I want to make sure the rack collar bottoms out on the housing before my plunger bottoms out. Yep, so that's looking good. Shut off should be all right, at least good enough to do a test run. Wide open throttle. Now we're hitting the stop, so that's wide open throttle. Spring stretch is good. Hold it about midway, and we'll simulate governor operation, trying to pull the rack back closed. It's just stretching that governor spring more, so it all looks good. It's all working like it should. So we're finally ready to put this on the engine, and up here at the front for that fuel gallery, it takes the same 8B4967 O-ring as we put it on the plug back here. And usually this is what they look like when they come out. People take these pumps off and they see this, what looks like a cone-shaped seal, and they think, oh, it's not an O-ring because it doesn't look anything like it. Well, trust me, this started out round at one time, but the way it gets mashed out on that taper, they always start looking like this. And this O-ring is the #1 cause for fuel getting in the crankcase on these old Caterpillars, D2s, D4s, so on and so forth. Anything with a pump that has this passage like this O-ring can start to leak. So if you get fuel coming out from behind that O-ring, it's being pressurized from the filter housing coming out through this furrow right here into that fuel manifold. It's going to leak out, pool in here, and eventually run down the front cover and end up down in the crankcase. Like I said, #1 spot for oil or fuel dilution in the oil comes from that O-ring right there. So when you get in here to replace that O-ring, also replace the gasket here, and also replace your seal at the same time for that injection pump, because as I've harped on this over and over again, those always need some help. So speaking of the pump to filter housing gasket, this is it, still available to a 3337 from Caterpillar. You can see that'll match up just fine right there. All right, seal's in place on the furrow, gasket's in place on the pump. Double checking our seal retainer down there around the offset tang drive on the accessory shaft. That's where it needs to be. We don't want to ding that like the last person did when they were in here. There. Can't fall off now. And the nuts that are back here between the engine block and the pump, you definitely need a long extension and a 9/16 swivel to access those. But honestly, I've been into a lot worse. So everything's tightened down here. Looks like we still have ease of movement. So the final thing we need to address is the hookup on the rack rod that's in the fuel tower opening here. So to do this hookup, I took this little front cover off. That's where our governor flyweights live in there, and we have the arm that they exert tension upon, and the bell crank on the end of this rod is what hooks up to the end of the rack rod right there. And we need to make sure that that bell crank is in the right position, because if our rod here that comes from the flyweights bottoms out before the fuel rack has compressed the torque spring and reached its full 100% open position, our flyweight rod would actually be limiting the performance of the engine. So we need to make sure that the bell crank on the end of this rod that I'm moving right now is out far enough. So if I compress the torque spring with one hand, we have the torque spring compressed, and I run the flyweight rod out of travel and bottom it out, it looks like we're darn near pretty much perfectly lined up, and the manual actually wants overlap. They stated 1/8 of an inch, so I'm going to need to move this bell crank out just a little bit. It would probably work where it's at with everything being perfectly in line, but I think we can make it better. And after one adjustment, I would say that's better. So we're ready to pin that. There we are. And somehow you need to put a cotter pin in on the back side of that thing. It's doable with some needle nose pliers, but I got to get the camera out of the way. So we're all put together, and just in case anybody still is a little bit foggy on how the whole system works, quick breakdown. At the back here, we have the governor spring saying more fuel. The flyweights up here in the front cover with centrifugal force are counteracting it, saying no less, close it back down, and they just kind of eventually come to a compromise based on throttle setting, which dictates how much governor spring tension the flyweights have to overcome. And the injection pump is just in the middle, getting pulled in two different directions and just trying to get the job done doing what it's told, a lot like happens to me at work. So to wrap things up, cover back on the front, put the little cover on the side of the filter housing, and we put the cover on the governor too. So normally I'd be setting pump lifter height right now, but we need to get a flywheel on this thing for some timing marks. So I think we're going to have to do something about that pretty soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please tune in again.